The stagecoach wheezed to a halt in the Montana dust, and Clara Danner stepped down into a street that measured people in glances. She was used to it, the
Traveling
double
alone?
takes, the quick
I am.
arithmetic strangers did, as their eyes climbed from her boots to her hat brim and still had inches to go. Tall, too much, she had heard every version of the same
We
small
already
verdict.
filled the
But
post.
the August light washed the boardwalks gold, and she stood straight anyway, back unbent palms, steady on the handle of her trunk. "Sure there ain't some mistake," Miss the station master asked, peering up beneath the brim of his sweat-dark hat. "You traveling alone, I am," Clara said evenly. "I have work, housekeeping for the Harrows." He tugged his hat, nodded in that sorry way men did when they expected a storm and didn't want to be under it. Clara crossed the street with the dust in a halo around her hem and the Bitterroot peaks throwing their long shadows across Garnet. She'd learned to carry her own trunk a long time ago, and she did it now, set jaw, easy breath. Mrs. Harrow opened the door before Clara could knock. Surprise flickered into discomfort so fast it looked rehearsed. "You're Miss Danner." "Yes, ma'am. You're very tall." Clara waited. It always came next. "I'm afraid there's been a misunderstanding," Mrs. Harrow said, hands flattening her apron. "We already filled the post, but your letter, I'm sorry." The door closed softly like a decision, and the latch clicked with the neatness of a period. Clara didn't plead. She stood spine straight until the ache under her sternum steadied. The street kept moving around her wagons, creaking a dog nosing upwind, the tin rattle of a sign, while her trunk sat where she'd left it, as if refusing to be embarrassed on her behalf. "You looking for somewhere to stay?" The voice came from farther down the boardwalk, low and sure. The man who walked toward her had the kind of quiet that settled a space dust on his boots work, cut into the brown of his forearms, a sun-bleached hat pushed back so green eyes could meet hers without squinting. He wasn't quite her height, but he didn't seem to notice. Or care. "Name's Thomas Sutton," he said. "Cabin up on the ridge. Spare room's clean. It's a ride, but it's warm." Clara narrowed her eyes. "Why offer that to a stranger?" He lifted one shoulder. "Because I watched him turn you out for no decent reason. Where I come from, you don't leave a woman standing in the street with a trunk and the light going." She studied his face for the kinds of angles she'd learned to avoid, the smirk that meant a bargain would be named later, the softness that meant pity expected obedience. She found neither. "I can carry my own trunk," I know Thomas said, already reaching for it. He lifted without show, just muscle meeting weight, then nodded toward two horses tied beside the mercantile. "You ride well enough." They rode without talk for the first mile, the trail tilting into cooler air and resin-sweet shade. Pines closed in like guardians, and when the cabin showed itself a simple, tight-joined thing tucked beneath tall trees with a slant of meadow spilling light up to the porch, it looked like a place that kept its promises. Thomas swung down and opened the door. "Pumps out back if you want to wash. Stew's on the stove. No need to earn it." Clara held the threshold, one palm on rough jam, the other, still on her hat. "You're not expecting anything in return?" His eyes were steady. "No, ma'am. You sleep safe under my roof, or not at all. That choice is yours." She stepped inside. It was plain, a small stove with a neat ring of wood, a table rubbed, smooth by years of elbows, two chairs, a shelf with tin cups, and a single blue plate that caught the light. Windows let the afternoon in without apology. A quilt folded square waited on a narrow bed in the corner, like an invitation extended and then left alone. Thomas set her trunk down, tossed a split of wood into the fire, and ladled stew into a bowl. He did not ask where she came from or why. He did not make conversation the way men sometimes did, like tossing a loso to see what they could catch. When he placed the bowl on the table, he added a heel of bread and a clean spoon, then took the other chair with a quiet nod that meant, "Eat, not talk." The first spoonful shocked her with its kindness, simple beef carrots, salt heat. She hadn't realized how long she'd been holding her breath until it loosened all at once. Thomas ate like a man who respected the work that brought food to a bowl. When she stood to help with the tinware, he let her no fuss, no theater, only a shared movement that made the cabin feel less like a corner and more like a room. Outside, wind went soft through pine needles. Inside, the stove ticked as iron gave up its heat. When she'd washed and dried the last cup, Clara straightened, meeting his gaze across that small slab of wood between them. "Thank you," she said. "You're welcome," Thomas answered, as if those words had been waiting in the house for someone to earn them again. The day had taken much, but as dusk laid a purple edge along the ridge, Clara felt something small and stubborn return a thread of steadiness tied to a man who didn't barter safety in a room that had made space for her without shrinking her to fit. She set her hat on the chair back, rolled her shoulders down, and just a little let her guard unclench. By the second morning, Clara was no longer content to sit idly by the hearth. She rose early, the hem of her work dress damp with dew, and went out where Thomas was stacking kindling by the barn. Without waiting for permission, she hefted the axe, lined up the grain, and split a log with the kind of determination that left no room for doubt. The swing was a little stiff, but it was true. "You ever done ranch work?" Thomas asked, leaning on the fence rail, green eyes catching hers. "I can learn," she answered, pulling her hair back with a leather tie and setting another log straight. He nodded once, no chuckle, no patronizing grin. Just acknowledgement. It was enough. From then on, she followed his rhythm through the days. Together, they fed the stock-repaired, sagging fence lines and cleaned tack worn smooth by years of use. The work was endless, but Clara met it with steady grit. She did not wilt under the sun or shy from the dirt that worked its way beneath her nails. And Thomas, unlike so many others, never once made her feel small for standing taller than the women in town or for insisting she could shoulder her share. Side by side, they grew into a cadence of silence and effort that spoke louder than any words. One afternoon, as she led his younger horse in a careful circle around the paddock, Clara caught him watching her. His gaze wasn't mocking, nor was it heavy with the kind of hunger she had learned to guard against. It was something steadier, almost reverent. She felt her chest tighten in a way that had nothing to do with the reins in her hand. Later, when the day's work was done, they sat on the porch, tin mugs of coffee cooling in their palms. The horizon flamed with the last streaks of sun, and Clara found her voice turning toward confession. "I was engaged once," she said quietly. 2 weeks before the wedding, he called it off. Said he couldn't stand the way I made him feel small." Thomas turned to her brows, drawing low his jaw set. "Then he was the one who was small." The words struck clean and certain like an axe hitting true. Clara's breath caught, and for the first time in years, she believed it might be true, that her height, her strength, her very presence weren't flaws to be excused, but truths to be honored. She held his gaze, and in the quiet, something unspoken passed between them. That evening, a storm rolled in without warning. Thunder cracked sharp over the south pasture, and the rain fell sudden and hard. Clara slipped in the mud, her boots sliding out from under her, and Thomas caught her by the waist before she hit the ground. The air was thick with petrichor, her breath ragged, his grip steady. Neither moved for a long second. "You all right?" he asked, voice roughened by more than the weather. She nodded, rain trailing down her cheek, but he did not let go right away. By the time they reached the porch, soaked through the storm still raged, but the space between them had changed. They sat down, shoulders brushing, neither speaking of what had happened in the pasture. Then slowly Thomas reached out and took her hand. He did not ask, and she did not resist. Her fingers closed around his, warm against the cool, damp air, and they sat like that silent, steady, a quiet vow forming between them, with nothing more than the touch of two hands in the rain. It was not yet love, not yet promise, but it was the start of trust earned through labor sealed in stormlight and carried forward on the strength of two people who refused to see each other as less than whole. The days stretched longer, each one marked by shared labor and quiet meals, until the question Thomas had been carrying finally broke the silence. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the porch creaked beneath their boots, he turned to Clara, his voice low but steady. "Do you want to stay?" The words hung in the cool air, not a command, not even an expectation, just an honest offering. Clara felt her pulse quicken. No man had ever asked her where she wished to belong. Most had told her, decided for her, or turned her away. She searched his face, green eyes, waiting without pressure, and the weight in her chest shifted. "Do you want me to?" she asked carefully, her voice thin as thread. Thomas nodded once. "I do." It was simple, but in its simplicity, it carried more certainty than all the elaborate vows she had heard in her past. She stepped closer, the rough boards groaning under her boots until there was no space left between them. For the first time in her life, she did not feel like a burden or an oddity. "I've never belonged anywhere," Clara whispered, her throat tight. You do here, Thomas said, his hand lifting to her cheek. And in that quiet beneath the fading sky, Clara believed him. The days that followed began to take on a rhythm neither of them had expected. Clara rose early, her long frame bent over the garden rows as she pulled weeds and checked the beans. By midday, the scent of bread or simmering stew drifted from the cabin, softening the hard edges of the place. Sometimes when she thought herself alone, she hummed a low, steady tune that seemed to stitch itself into the air. Thomas, working in the barn, would pause without meaning to listening, as though the land itself had found a voice through her. One afternoon, he carried in a stack of ledgers, worn and smudged from seasons of half-kept notes. Clara sat at the table, brows drawn as she studied the numbers. Her fingers traced the tallies until she stopped tapping lightly. This is entered twice, she said, lifting her gaze. Thomas frowned, leaning over her shoulder. She was right, the sale had been miscounted. He let out a slow breath, half amusement, half relief. That explains the Dobbin boys grumbling. Clara smiled faintly, then turned the page. She didn't ask if he wanted her help. She simply began correcting the entries. And Thomas, watching her steady confidence, realized the ranch sounded different, now more whole, as if her presence balanced the silence he had carried too long. The wind pressed low across the ridge that night, carrying with it the crisp bite of oncoming frost. Clara and Thomas sat outside with a lantern between them, the shadows stretching long across the porch. She tilted her head, eyes on the tree line. Do you ever wonder, she asked softly, what life might have been if I hadn't turned down this road? Thomas didn't answer right away. He watched the stars flicker sharp above them, then finally said, I used to think this place was only workland to fence stock to feed. Nothing more. But since you came, he paused as though weighing each word. It feels like something worth keeping. You've changed the weight of it. Her chest tightened at the confession, a warmth threading beneath the chill. She turned toward him, searching his face. I've always been told I was strange. Wrong somehow. He shook his head, firm and quiet. You're not strange, Clara. You're rare. The words lingered in the cool air, stronger than any promise. She didn't speak, only reached across the narrow space and let her fingers slide into his. His hand closed around hers, steady and sure. In the silence, the wind settled, and the simple act of holding on defined what it meant to remain, to keep not out of need, but out of choice. Clara had always carried an instinct to orient herself to claim unfamiliar ground by sketching its lines and contours. One afternoon, she spread a scrap of old flour sack across the table, smudging the surface with charcoal as she traced the creek bend, the fence lines, and the rise behind the barn. By dusk, she had rendered the ranch in her own hand, a map both practical and deeply personal. When she tacked it inside the barn wall, Thomas paused in his work, eyes lingering longer than he intended. He didn't say much, but later she caught him brushing his fingertips across the edge of the cloth, a gesture more reverent than words. A week later, they rode into town for supplies. Clara's long frame and steady stride drew the usual stares from behind counters and half-shut doors. The shopkeeper's daughter narrowed her eyes, whispering to a friend while measuring flour. Clara felt the heat of judgment pressing on her skin, an echo of the countless times she had been marked too much. But this time Thomas stood quietly at her side, his shoulder near hers, his hand brushing her back with a subtle touch that said more than any defense could. He did not argue with them. He simply remained close, his presence enough to make her feel seen rather than scrutinized. On the ride home, the supplies rattling in the cart, Thomas broke the silence. You ever think about building something lasting here? Clara turned to him, surprised. A home. Something more than a roof, he said, keeping his eyes on the ridgeline. Something that won't be taken from us. The words settled in her chest like a seed catching soil. She remembered the slammed doors, the places she had been cast out, and how often her height, her difference, had been treated as a reason to deny her belonging. Now, in the shadow of the pines, she let herself imagine walls built not out of obligation, but choice. She met his gaze briefly, her expression steady. Then let's build it. It was not yet a promise, but it was the first blueprint of a shared future. The air had sharpened with the first bite of frost when Clara stood by the fence line, watching the ridge catch the last light. Thomas joined her, his coat brushing hers, his voice low but certain. You don't have to stay here just because you've got nowhere else. She turned, meeting his steady gaze. I'm staying because I want to. The words were simple, but they carried the weight of every locked door and every dismissal she had endured. Thomas reached up, brushing a loose strand from her temple. Then I'll make sure this land carries your name as much as mine. For the first time, belonging wasn't borrowed, it was promised, carved into the future, like roots gripping soil. ChatGPT, John Noy. By early autumn, Clara's presence had stitched itself into every corner of the cabin. Her boots sat neatly by the door, her gloves tucked into the porch rail, and above the stove hung bundles of sage and pennyroyal she had gathered with patient hands. The space no longer looked like one man's holding, it breathed with the rhythms of two. She moved through the rooms with quiet assurance, not as a guest but as someone who belonged. One morning, Thomas came in from the barn with a folded paper in hand. "Letter from Helena," he said, laying it on the table. It was an invitation to a ranchers' meeting, a gathering of stock buyers and landowners from across the territory. Clara set aside her mending, the thread still caught between her fingers. She studied him, waiting. He hesitated only briefly before saying, "I was thinking we could both go. It's a 2-day ride, but there's room in the wagon." His tone was casual, but the weight behind it was anything but. Clara nodded slowly. She could have let him go alone, stayed behind, as she had in so many places before. But this was different. "Then I'll pack what we need," she said, her voice calm but sure. For the first time in her life, travel didn't feel like exile. It felt like choosing to stand beside someone. Where Thomas went, she would go, and that she realized was the beginning of building a life together. That night, beneath the cottonwoods where brittle leaves carpeted the ground, Clara and Thomas made camp. The fire crackled low, sending sparks into a sky already bruised with autumn chill. Clara pressed her palms close to the flame, her gaze steady, her voice soft. "Do you ever think about the kind of life you'll have in 10 years? Thomas poked at the coals with a stick, his movements deliberate. "I used to think I wouldn't have one," he admitted. "Now I imagine something quiet, steady, a life with someone who doesn't flinch when things get hard." His eyes caught the firelight as he spoke, their honesty cutting through the night air. Clara let the warmth seep into her fingers. She had long believed her fate was to pass through borrowed rooms, always a shadow in someone else's house. But here under the stars and beside this man, that belief began to dissolve. She looked at him, her voice low but certain. "I was never someone to build a life with. Always passing through. But I'm not passing through here." Thomas didn't rush to answer. He simply shifted closer, their shoulders nearly touching, letting silence seal the truth between them. In that moment, Clara knew she was no longer a stranger on the road. She was home. Helena struck Clara like a rush of noise, and color wagons creaked down crowded streets. Chimneys smoked and merchants called out their wares. She lingered near a hardware stall until a young woman offered her a bent pressed flower bookmark. "It won't sell," the woman shrugged, "but it's too pretty to waste." Clara tucked it carefully into her coat pocket. It felt like a fragile token, proof that even small beauty could endure. Later that evening, she joined Thomas by the livestock tents. He watched buyers haggle, his stance quiet and steady. Clara studied the rhythm of the place, the hard bartering over animals and feed. When they paused at a blacksmith's stall, Thomas picked up a simple iron horseshoe. She arched a brow. "Superstition," he shook his head. "Habit. My brother nailed one over every stall. For luck." Clara reached to take it, her fingers brushing his. "Then we'll hang it over the barn door when we're home." His faint smile was answer enough. At the boarding house that night, their room was small draft, slipping under the door lamplight, thin on the walls. Clara stood by the window, watching oil lamps flicker across the Helena streets. She turned, her voice barely above the hush of wind outside. "I never imagined sharing a roof wouldn't feel like a burden." Thomas sat at the edge of the bed, unlacing his boots. His gaze lifted to hers, steady and sure. "You're not a burden, Clara. You're the reason the roof feels like home." The words settled between them, heavier and more lasting than stone. Back in the narrow boarding room, the fire in the grate flickered low, painting soft light across the floorboards. Clara, her hand resting at the base of Thomas's throat, let the words come with a courage she hadn't known she still carried. "When I think of 10 years from now, I see morning's worn gloves in you." Thomas didn't falter, his eyes steady as pine held hers. "Then we'll build it," he said simply. "No grand promises, only the kind of vow made strong by its plainness." The future stopped feeling like a punishment and began to sound like something she could choose. He drew her into his arms, then not with urgency but with care, as though holding her too tightly might break the fragile truth they had spoken. For the first time in her life, Clara didn't brace herself in an embrace. She allowed it, leaned into it, and discovered that being held without demand could be as steadying as a foundation stone. When they returned from Helena, the land lay quiet under the first chill of late autumn. Clara carried the horseshoe in her pocket the whole way, its weight a small but certain promise. At the barn, Thomas took it from her hand, hammered it above the doorframe, and stepped back. The simple iron piece gleamed faintly in the slanting light, a charm against misfortune, but also a mark of beginning something that said this place belonged to more than just him. He turned then, brushing the dust from his palms, and spoke without ornament. "I don't just want you here, Clara. I want your hand, and I want your name beside mine on this land." There was no hesitation in her answer. The woman who had been cast aside for being too tall, too much too different, now stood tall in choice. She nodded once, steady and certain. "Yes, because it's ours, because I belong here with you." It was not a proposal dressed in silver or ceremony, but it was stronger, two people claiming both love and ownership of their lives side by side with nothing left to bargain. The weeks after their quiet promise carried a new weight of purpose. Thomas began work on a lean-to beside the barn, his movements more deliberate than before. He measured twice, sometimes 3 times, before cutting a board, the kind of care a man gives to something he wants to last beyond him. Clara watched him once from the porch, the afternoon sun catching on his sleeves as he checked each angle again. And she realized this wasn't just about shelter. It was about permanence, about building a life strong enough to stand storms. That same care shaped her own days. She rode the fence line, hammer and nails at her saddle, testing each post with practiced patience. The land was learning her handprint just as she was learning its breath. It was near the Cottonwood Bend that she saw him, a rider old and weathered, his horse, long-legged ribs faint beneath the hide. He raised a hand in greeting, not menace, and reined in at a respectful distance. Elias Traeger, he called, voice rough with years. Used to run cattle east of here. Thought I'd see if the land remembered me. Clara inclined her head, but his eyes were already on the ridge. Saw smoke up that way. Could be trappers. Could be others. Not the honest sort. Keep your doors bolted at dusk. She felt a chill that wasn't from the wind. How many? 2, maybe 3. Enough to make trouble. He tipped his hat, then turned back toward the trees, leaving only his warning behind. Clara swung into her saddle, heart pounding, and pressed her mare hard toward home. By the time the cabin came into view, Thomas was stacking hay in the loft. She didn't call out, only waited until his eyes met hers. Her words were simple, but carried the weight of what she'd heard. "There's trouble." The warning from Traeger shifted the rhythm of their home overnight. Thomas moved through the cabin with a quiet precision, bolting the door, checking the rifle above the mantel, and setting shells in a neat line inside the drawer. Clara filled the lamps and trimmed their wicks, her hands steady even as her chest tightened. Neither of them named the fear aloud, but it settled in the air as thick as smoke. When the wind pressed against the shutters, Thomas walked the perimeter of the cabin, his boots muffled on the wood floor. He tested each latch, each hinge, until he was satisfied nothing would give under strain. Clara watched from the window, wrapped in her coat like a shield, and felt a strange comfort in his discipline. Every careful motion said more than words ever could. "You are not unguarded here." Near midnight, the knock came low and firm. Thomas already had the rifle in hand. "Name yourself," he called. Traeger came the reply, steady through the wood. Thomas slid the bolt, and the older man stepped inside, his face lined by lantern light. "I came back because I thought you ought to know," he said, removing his hat. "I saw their camp tonight. 3 men. Not the kind who trap or trade. They've got rifles and they're too close." Thomas's jaw tightened. "How close?" "Half a mile, maybe less." "They're watching the ridge." For a moment, silence pressed hard between the 3 of them. Then Thomas nodded once. "Then we'll let them see it's not unguarded." They divided the night into watches. Traeger took the barn, a weathered silhouette against the hay. Thomas sat on the porch with his rifle laid across his knees, eyes sweeping the tree line. Clara kept the window, the lamp dimmed to a whisper. She did not flinch from the darkness, though her hands remained tight around the curtain. Morning broke clear and cold. The ridge lay empty, no tracks near the fence, no smoke curling skyward. Yet the unease remained embedded deep. The threat might have passed, but the discipline of that long night clung to them both, a reminder that safety was not granted, only guarded, and that together, vigilance was its own kind of vow. With dawn came resolve. The brief reprieve from danger pushed Thomas and Clara to act not with panic, but with purpose. Together they moved through the day, strengthening the farm as if every nail and board was a promise. Thomas barred the barn from the inside with a second door he had fashioned thick enough to stop any forced entry. Clara walked the fence line with him, helping reset posts and tightening rails, her gloves stiff with cold, but her pace tireless. What might have felt like drudgery to others carried weight now. Each task was an act of claiming their ground, refusing to be driven off. When they paused by the paddock, Thomas studied her with an intensity that held more than admiration. "You're not just strong," he said finally, his voice roughened by honesty. "You're steady. That's what I needed, though. I never knew it." Clara met his gaze without flinching, a faint smile softening her face. In her chest, the old ache of being called too much shifted into something new enough, exactly as she was. As twilight bled across the ridge, they found themselves inside the cabin once more. The fire low but steady. The quiet stretched warm, and Thomas stepped closer, his hand brushing the edge of her sleeve before lifting to her cheek. She leaned into his touch, certain this time, and when he kissed her, it wasn't with haste, but with the surety of stone setting into place. It was more than affection. It was a vow to build not only safety, but a life, a home, and a future they would share as equals. Every day afterward carried the rhythm of progress. By late October, the cabin and barn bore new signs of care. Together, Thomas and Clara laid the last stones for the smokehouse foundation, their boots sinking into the cold soil as they tested each layer for steadiness. Inside the barn, Thomas ran his calloused palm over the newly set crossbar of the second door firm, secure, a symbol that nothing would breach their home without effort. These improvements were small in the eyes of others, but to them each hammer strike and lifted beam was part of something greater, the building of permanence. One evening after chores, Thomas brought a small wooden box to the table. Its corners were smoothed by hand, its lid lined with a square of calico. "Made this for your books or whatever you want to keep," he said, sliding it across. Clara opened it slowly, fingertips tracing the grain, as if memorizing the care carved into it. "You keep giving me pieces of this place," she whispered, her voice both soft and steady. Thomas met her gaze. "Because I want every part of it to have you in it." For a woman who had once been turned away at doors, dismissed for her height, her difference, the gift struck deep. It was not just wood, but proof that she belonged. That night, wind curled sharp around the cabin's eaves, rattling like a test of their resolve. Yet inside, with the box resting near the hearth and the fire glowing low, Clara no longer felt the bite of fear. The walls held more than timber. They held trust, care, and the quiet certainty that storms might circle. But within these walls, she was no longer alone. The first snow came softly, not yet thick enough to blanket the ground, but enough to silver the rooftops and line the fence tops in white. Clara stood in the doorway, breathing in the sharp scent of winter as she hung bundles of mint and lavender above the hearth. Their fragrance mixed with wood smoke, filling the cabin with a warmth that felt more like home than any fire alone could give. The season was changing, and so was she, no longer a guest but a keeper of this place. Later that afternoon, while searching through a bottom drawer for spare cloth, Clara's hand brushed against a stack of yellowed envelopes tied with rough twine. She carried them to the table and opened one. The ink faded, but the words still clear. They were letters from Thomas's brother written years ago. As she read, she saw a picture of Thomas, painted not by himself, but by someone who had known him deeply, his patience with animals, his quiet strength, the way silence was his truest language. These words affirmed what she had already begun to feel. Thomas was not just steady in labor, but steady in heart. When Thomas entered from the barn, snow dusting his shoulders, he froze at the sight of the letters in Clara's hands. For a moment he seemed caught between pride and grief. "I kept them to remember who I was," he admitted, his voice low. Clara met his eyes and replied gently, "And you still are that man." It was not praise but recognition, a truth he had long needed someone else to say. For Thomas, it felt like being seen twice, once by his brother, and now again by the woman who had chosen to stand beside him. That evening, as wind pressed against the cabin walls, Clara unfolded the quilt she had been piecing together for weeks. Strips of worn shirts, a corner of an old curtain, bits of wool salvaged from a coat, each square stitched with steady hands, each seam carrying the rhythm of her care. At the center, faint but deliberate, she had embroidered two initials, side by side, hers and Thomas's. When she spread it across their bed, the cabin seemed to breathe easier, as if the fabric itself was sealing the promise of belonging. Thomas paused at the sight, his hand resting on the quilt's edge. For a long moment he said nothing, only tracing the stitched letters with his thumb. Finally his voice came quiet but sure. "I never thought I'd have a home again." Clara looked up, her gaze steady, and answered simply, "Now you do. And so do I." It wasn't a grand declaration, but it carried more weight than vows shouted before a crowd. It was recognition that the walls around them, the quilt beneath their hands, and the trust between them had turned this place into something greater than shelter. For the first time, both knew they had a home. On a clear morning after the first snow had melted into the soil, Thomas led Clara to the south ridge. The ground was dark and soft-smelling of earth, ready for new beginnings. He knelt, pressing his palm against it, then looked up. "This is where I'd want to build," he said. Clara stayed atop her mare for a moment, watching the horizon stretch wide and open, then asked, "You mean the house?" He nodded, his voice calm but certain. "A kitchen big enough for you to hang 10 bundles of herbs without ducking. A bedroom that won't creak each time I turn." Clara dismounted slowly, her boots sinking into the softened ground beside him. She bent down, fingertips brushing the soil. "Then let's start planning it," she replied, her tone steady. They spoke plainly, setting a rhythm for the future. If the spring proved dry, they would break ground before the first thaw. No rushing, no illusions, just the promise of a house shaped by both their hands, meant to stand against seasons and storms. As they stood together on that ridge, the thought of a new foundation became more than a plan. It was the quiet architecture of hope made real. One quiet afternoon, Clara returned from the barn with a small, linen-wrapped bundle in her hands. She placed it in front of Thomas without a word. When he unwrapped the cloth, two simple rings revealed themselves, smoothly carved from cherry wood, the strongest beam they had salvaged from the old corral. She explained softly, "I wanted something that lasts. Wood remembers the hands that shape it." Thomas turned the larger ring between his fingers, the grain catching the light like a secret flame. With care, he slid it onto his left hand. Then, taking hers, he fitted the smaller band over her knuckle, slow and steady. It settled snug, neither loose nor tight, just right, as if it had been waiting for her all along. They did not speak vows or make promises dressed in ceremony. Yet in that moment, the ring spoke for them, a bond built of resilience, quiet devotion, and a life they had already begun weaving together. One crisp evening, Thomas set aside his tools and told Clara what had been weighing on his mind. Come spring, he said he wanted to ride to the land office and register their claim under both their names. Not just his, but hers as well. Partner in truth, not in shadow. The words were plain, yet they carried the weight of trust she had never been given before. Later, they sat wrapped in blankets on the porch, while stars spilled across the Montana sky. Thomas admitted he had once believed such a life was beyond reach, but now he could not imagine it without her. Clara rested her head against his shoulder, knowing he meant every word, and for the first time the silence around them felt like belonging. He laced his fingers through hers and spoke quietly. Whether or not children came, whether the house was loud with laughter or hushed with only their voices choosing each other, would always be enough. Clara tightened her grip, sealing the vow not with speeches or ceremony, but with the steady rhythm of two hearts beating in agreement beneath the night sky. Winter settled over the ridge with a softness that belied its cold. Snow dusted the barn roof and muted the sound of the world, until each day seemed to move slower, quieter. Work shifted from long hours in the field to steady tasks indoors, mending harnesses, drying herbs, stacking wood close by the hearth. The cabin grew warmer, not only from the fire, but from the rhythm of two people moving in unspoken accord, sharing labor and ease in equal measure. One afternoon, Clara stood by the window while the frost patterned the glass. With a scrap of parchment, she wrote a few lines not for anyone else to read, but to remind herself of what she had found here. She wrote of silence that no longer felt like exile, of the way stillness could mean safety and belonging, rather than loneliness. The words were simple, but they carried the weight of years she had once believed lost. That night, wrapped together beneath the quilt she had pieced from scraps of old cloth, Thomas whispered his hope, "May every winter be like this." His voice was roughened by weather and work, but it held the clarity of truth. Clara rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady beat beneath. "It will," she answered softly, "as long as we keep choosing each other." It was no grand vow, no spectacle, only the quiet promise that their survival, their joy, and their home were one and the same.